Hi, I'm Charlene Tate, Director of Development, and I'm joined by Mike McCreadie from Studio 3. And Mike's here to talk to us about Studio 3 and a specific project that we're working on together at the moment, the Atlas work throughout Scottish Autism. Welcome to Scottish Autism, Mike. Would you start by telling us a wee bit about Studio 3?
Studio 3 started quite a few years ago. It started originally as a training company from a group of guys who were studying psychology, and at the time were working in care homes, and were quite appalled by what they observed and the way that people were managed and some of the practices. And it evolved as to a company which was a training company originally, looking at how to reduce restrictive practices for people with autism, for people with intellectual disabilities, for people with dementia. So it was very much about giving people lives back who might have been in long-term institutional care. And then it evolved to have a separate company, the company that I sit in, which is a clinical company, where we complement the work of the training company and look at least restrictive practice and something in particular called the Low Arousal approach, which is evidenced within the literature and is even adopted by a number of different frameworks and has grown in popularity, mainly within the last 10, 15 years. And looking at the interaction between staff and families and the person with autism. And a lot of our work is working with organisations like yourself, who've got very much spirit about freeing people up, giving them the life that they want, and those are part of our core values in terms of training staff and providing clinical support and clinical input.
And I think that's the key thing for two organisations. We're a good fit. We've got the same kind of value base. So a bunch of guys studying psychology. Tell us a wee bit about yourself.
Well, about me. Well, I joined the company a bit later. As you know, I used to work for the National Autistic Society, but the NES had been using Studio 3 for some time. And myself and the director, the chief exec of Studio 3, Andy McDonald, we'd kind of known of each other for a while, but never had an opportunity to meet. And then in one Irish bar at a South African conference, we bumped into each other. And from there we started a conversation because we were both coming at this from different angles, but with we discovered we've got a core beliefs. And that being not really changing people with autism per se, but changing the things which are around them, changing about how we interpret their behaviour. And I know that's core, certainly to an organisation like Scottish Autism. And looking at the supports around the person, looking about the family, looking about everything else, and looking at the stress within the person and how life stresses that individual. And that conversation kind of continued, and eventually I left the NES to come and work full time as consultant clinical director for Studio 3, and we work with organisations who we agree that there's a commonality with. So we don't just work with anyone. There has to be a dovetailing of common themes in Scottish Autism, and there's a range of organisations, not just in the UK, but throughout Europe, and we work in South Africa, and we're about to start work in Australia. And I think as of today, my colleague Andy's flying off to Canada, and he's been commuting back and forward to there for the last 3 months. So it's about organisations, so it doesn't have to be within a country, but where there is a spirit and where there's an ethos which is complementary to how we view things.
Which is very refreshing, because the culture of an organisation really sets the tone for everything. And you mentioned least restrictive practice. Can you say a wee bit about what you actually mean about that, how you define that?
Well, least restrictive practice is looking at really kind of releasing the restrictions in the person's life, and it's about control. And very often we can feel that a person has autism, has a disability, and we take control from them. And very much in doing that, we further not only disable the person, but we restrict their opportunities for learning and development of skills. People with autism, with disability, can put themselves in vulnerable situations, so it's also being aware of that, and sometimes they might need the more restrictions just to keep them safe, but it's about moving that back and forward relative to the needs which ebb and flow in the person's life. And many organisations we found would be very restrictive and never lift those barriers at all from a person, even though the person needs to move and needs to grow.
Yeah.
And Emerson, who's very well cited within the literature on challenging behaviour, in a relatively recent study for people with very challenging behaviour, found that you could reduce challenging behaviour by 50% just by giving the person more control in their life. And that's something that very much resonates within a kind of Studio 3 ethos. It's about getting people into the community, allowing them to meet the goals which are meaningful for them, but also doing it in a way that keeps them safe and doesn't have too many restrictions, and helping build confidence in staff teams and in families, and we find that's a very, very important facet of our work, is building confidence for people to almost go, okay, I can let go. As I say, Annie McDonald has even worked on measures for controllability measures within staff, so that even as staff teams we can reflect on our own values in terms of control, and that's quite profound.
And that's really interesting, because there's a real temptation to focus on the person and locate the problem within the person, but what you're really doing is looking at the interaction, the dynamics between the person, the staff member, the family member, the significant others in that person's life, which is a different kind of approach.
And it's almost going back to Bronfenbrenner's systems, ecological systems of human development, and we say, okay, we've got the person in the centre, whether the child or whether the adult, but it's all of these things around that person, and we would argue that for too long, and I think there is a sea change now, that for too long it's been about trying to change the child or trying to change this adult with autism. And given all the amount of money that's been poured in, the change has been very, very small. We're not that
pointless.
Pointless, utterly pointless. And then really, we're not that much further forward than when Asperger and Kanner had first described autism. But then it's that question, why do we need to change this person anyway? We need to keep the person safe. We need to give them the goals in life they want, but maybe it's about us changing us and changing the things around the person, and that's why we work with organisations who embrace that kind of way, but sometimes that's not for every organisation.
They're not ready maybe for that.
We would argue that they wouldn't be ready for that, and that's maybe about growth and change within them. And we're very interested in those organisational cultures.
The other term you used was low arousal, and that's knocked about a lot, isn't it? And I was quite interested when we were speaking earlier about Andy's kind of ownership of that. That was an interesting one. But tell me what you mean by that, because I do think it appears in lots of different literature and in lots of other areas. And
it does get misrepresented because people often think, well, low arousal is allowing anybody to do what they like. And we often are clear, that's not what it is. It's a term which Andy coined in the research literature and which has been used then throughout and by other organisations, sometimes misinterpreted. But it is very much back to the notion of being aware of ourselves with that person. If that person is so stressed and distressed, we can't make demands of them, and we should have to alter our demands of the person. And what we also need to look at the distress in ourselves. So low arousal is looking at the arousal in the individual and the arousal in ourselves, and we've extended that into our work on Atlas and looking at autism in a stress model, and there's a growing amount of interest in this because whilst autism is heterogeneous, which means, as you know, very different from individual to individual, to famously quote Rita Jordan, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. But stress is a universal. It's a universal for the person with autism, and it's a universal in us.
Absolutely.
So it's looking at the arousal on a physiological level in the person, on a psychological level in the person, but also the arousal within the person supporting that.
Absolutely.
Whether it's a mum, whether it's a dad,
Yeah.
whether it's a brother or sister, whether it's
Yeah.
a person employed, whether it's an
Yeah.
organisation, and looking at how we can alter arousal levels and how the person's arousal level will affect their communication, their understanding, their cognition.
Yeah.
And now more profound level about how our arousal affects our appraisal of that person, affects our understanding and their meaning of their behaviour.
Yeah.
So it's not simply just letting a person do whatever
Switch
they
the
want.
lights off,
So
draw the curtains.
draw the curtains. It's far more radical,
Yeah.
and it's almost like a colleague of mine in Denmark fairly recently, who again have started yet another Atlas program, said to me, this is like a paradigm shift.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're not trying to change the person per se, you're trying to very much look at the relationship between the arousal in them and the arousal in the people supporting them.